Thank you for being here. My name's Beck, and this is my dissertation defense. And my dissertation is titled Designing Restoration, Protecting and Restoring Our Attention Through Participatory Design. There are three main offerings of this dissertation that I want to tell you about. The first of these offerings are products. There's a 10-week undergraduate curriculum and a toolkit of resources for library workers that support them in designing restorative environments. Now, restorative environments are simply environments that restore our attention from the demands of life. And so the first offering of my dissertation are these two products. The dissertation also offers some processes. It offers a process for creating conditions to support the restoration of people who are designing restorative environments. So it's not just designing the environment and having people come to it to restore. It is the process of designing actually being restorative. And then the third offering of the dissertation is that it offers insights into how to cultivate the presence that is required to hold space for co-designers of restorative environments. And that is two populations, a population of undergraduate students and a population of library workers. So those are the offerings. And there are many ways that I could guide you through those offerings. There's a lot of different stories I could tell. So for example, I could walk you through the toolkit of resources that has been created by library workers for library workers. It's a 48-page guidebook and a website that features 24 different design activities, and I'd love to walk you through each one. I could also tell the story of my lengthy and rigorous data analyses. I used digital and analog methods to analyze the data. There is a ton of data that I have qualitatively analyzed for this dissertation. And I even coded my own qualitative data analysis software using an app called Tinderbox, and I would just love to geek out with you over those things. And then there's the story of telling about the theoretical underpinnings of my research, how the attention economy works, how attention restoration theory works, all the things I've learned about contemplative practice and contemplative studies. And those are they so deeply influence everything I've done here. And I would love to tell you about those. But if I told you about those stories, I wouldn't have time to tell you the story that I want to tell the most, which is the story of how this dissertation has changed the way that I see the world. And that story starts in 2019. I taught 2 consecutive quarters of a class called Info 360. And this is a required undergraduate informatics design course. Each course had 40-some undergraduate students, eager mostly to learn about the process of design. Now, right before I taught that course, I had been awarded a seed grant from the UW Resilience Lab to create a map of restorative environments on campus. I had applied for this grant because I had been studying attention restoration theory, which is a theory that outlines how certain conditions make an environment restorative. And I was puzzled how campus was such a stressful place to be, and it was also filled with spaces that technically met the criteria of a restorative environment. I was also studying participatory design, which participatory design is simply involving the people who are affected by the design of something into the design process. And I thought, who better to design a map of restorative environments on campus than the students that the map was for? And last, I had been studying contemplative pedagogy, and that's simply a way of teaching that helps students cultivate connection and presence while also achieving whatever learning goals it is that you're teaching. And I thought that that might overlay with this idea of restorative environments nicely, so that maybe on the front of the map, there could be this, where the restorative environments are, and on the back of it, there could be contemplative practices that you do in those spaces. Now, I was interested in all of these things because I thought that they might help us mitigate and maybe even repair some of the harms of the attention economy. And you may have heard about the attention economy. It's essentially the market that incentivizes tech and media companies to make their products so addictive. They harvest data about us through our attention, and then they sell that data as predictions about what we will do. So I used attention restoration theory and contemplative pedagogy and participatory design, and I designed a syllabus. And I have this thing that says, check it out, becktinch.com/dissertation. And I'm going to upload the dissertation once I find out if I need to make any changes. So that will be available to you shortly. So I created a syllabus that integrated the three of these things. And I gave my students democratic control over what we designed and how we designed it, as long as it was under an umbrella of helping students experience restorative environments. Across the two courses, students developed really interesting and divergent approaches to this design problem. But what they created isn't what my dissertation is about. What was more interesting was how they seemed to be affected by the process of creating restorative environments. And I discovered this through reading final reflections of the course, where they describe changes in their perspectives, particularly their perspectives around campus, technology, themselves, and each other. So I'd like to share an example for you. This is an example from a student who was reflecting on the experience of the noticing practice. This was an assignment to pick an object and notice it for the entire quarter. And every week you would take a picture and upload it to the assignment to show one moment of noticing for that week. And here's the student's assignment submission, and they noticed the shape of a star. Here's what they wrote in their reflection. What started out as me keeping my eyes open for stars turned into me paying more attention to my environment and surroundings and seeing everything I pass by. I notice things now, not just stars. I notice small tattoos and spelling errors and dust on dumbbells. I am more aware of everything around me. I have started noticing moments of gratitude, and not only that, I take time to appreciate what I'm grateful for. I have learned to slow down and be aware of not only what's going on around me, but also what is going on with myself. I want to continue to live life with my eyes wide open, and I think I can grow to be able to notice moments that aren't so great, because there's value in taking time to appreciate when I may not be happy or grateful. Reading reflections like these surprised me because it wasn't the goal of the class to have students personally restore, even though we were focused on restoration for students. But it was also a familiar feeling. Before I started this program, I worked as a designer in science museums. My title at the museum that I worked for was called Director for Innovation and Digital Engagement. And I was responsible for integrating technology into our exhibits. And I did that with the aim of helping people slow down and notice the world, because slowing down and noticing the world is a fundamental piece of science as a way of knowing. But over time, I felt like the work that I was doing was lacking integrity, because there is this inherent tension between using technology to get people to slow down and notice the world. We had invested so much time and resource into these digital experiences, and from a learning perspective, they paled in comparison to simply putting some blocks on a table. I started to feel that the only one who was actually slowing down was me. And when I read these student reflections, I thought maybe this is what also is happening to my students. So I decided to explore this whole thing with my dissertation, and I formulated 3 research questions and designed 3 studies to answer them. The first 2 studies, Q1 and Q2, they explore the nature of the class, and they see the nature of the changes my students experienced and if those changes were common among them. The third study explored how, if at all, it might work to take this curriculum and try it somewhere else. And in particular, I wanted to see if it would work in libraries, because I've worked with library workers for over a decade, And I realized that they experience a lot of stress and sort of a chronic level of low morale in their work because it's really hard work. And so that has the same sort of conflict as the map of restorative environments, where you have this environment that is technically teeming with restorative potential, but the people that are in it day in and day out are really stressed. So I'm going to go through each of the 3 studies to tell you what I did. In the first study, I answered the following question: how can individuals protect and restore their attention when many of their interactions are mediated by technologies that are incentivized to exploit it? I researched this question using a method called reflexive thematic analysis, and I analyzed 389 assignment submissions. So like that one star assignment that you just saw would be one of those. I analyzed 389 assignment submissions from 86 undergraduates. The findings of this research question are the learning outcomes of one of the processes that I mentioned at the beginning. So through this analysis, I discovered 5 broad themes that helped me better understand what happened in the course. Through the design of restorative environments on campus, students slowed down and they noticed the world around them by experimenting with new, more present ways of being in that world. And they also would describe feelings of delight and gratitude associated with those moments. And that was 88% of the students. Students also changed how they related to their environment by noticing how their environment affects their stress and attention, and also seeing the restorative features of places that they inhabit every day. They were also more present in those environments. That was 77% of students. Students were more connecting with each other over their common struggles. So this was generally in the context of having class discussions or conversations with their friends, where they practiced empathetic listening, and that was 65%. And then there were a couple of other themes that weren't as represented in the data, but I thought were very important and germane to this issue. And one was that students use technology differently. This was 37% of students reported changing using technology differently by trying new behaviors like minimizing technology in certain situations, and also having a more nuanced view of the benefits and drawbacks of digital media. And some students also talked about challenging their assumptions, and in particular, their assumptions about stress and productivity, and even their assumptions about these long-held beliefs that they had about who they were and what's possible. And a few students even described feeling newly hopeful about change and that it's possible. So I should mention that while every student in the study, 86 students, is represented at least once in these change codes, the students didn't all change in the same ways or to the same degree. This histogram shows you that each bar is a student, that there are like 5 little bars over here at the left. Those 5 little bars are 5 students who've only had one code that was coded change. And over here on the right, we have 3 students who had over 20 each. And so this is sort of the distribution of how change was experienced in the class. I also want to say a huge limitation to this work is the fact that the assignment submissions were graded. And so the way that they reported their experiences was no doubt affected by that. I tried to mitigate this in terms of asking for their consent at the end of course, not knowing if they consented until things had been graded, giving it to a third party, those sorts of things. But there's no question that the data itself had that as just a fundamental, the power dynamic between the teacher and students is a fundamental limitation there. So as I was analyzing these data, every once in a while, I would come across a student who said that the class was restorative to them. And that sounded something like, coming to class to me was in and of itself restorative. And so for the second study, I interviewed those students to better understand what they meant. And I formulated the following research question: how can the design process itself be restorative? And I interviewed the five students who had written that way, using a method called interpretive phenomenological analysis. And I use this method because it is meant to find a small, homogeneous example of people who are experiencing the same kind of phenomenon, and then make sure that you can dive deeply into that and see what is similar about them. So in a lot of research, we're looking for breadth. This research, you're really narrowing down. I conducted hour-long interviews with each of the undergrads about 6 months after the course had ended. And then I analyzed the transcripts. And the findings of this study are these cultural conditions under the process piece. So basically, what I found through these conversations, which were a lot of fun, is that there was a classroom culture that supported restoration. And these three themes were sort of what helped make that culture supportive. The first theme was foregrounding humanity. And this simply meant that I let students be human. I did this by helping them feel psychologically and socially safe. I gave them a lot of freedom and agency over what we did in class and also what we did as a whole. And I invited them to be real in the space with each other. And most of that was through thoughtfully scaffolded conversations between students. And these activities added up over time, and their consistency made the class a kind of haven from the rest of the world. Another condition that supported restoration was generosity. I used the power that I had as an instructor to implement course policies that demonstrated how much I trusted students. These policies affected deadlines and grades and often framed our work as low stakes. And it meant that students didn't have to perform work or pretend to be something they weren't. And over time, students relaxed and they were warm and non-judgmental with each other and with themselves. And then last, modeling care meant that I made the first move. So I invested in students in my own particular way, which for me is drawing slides, and I memorized their names before the class began. And I sent them cute and silly little reminders of assignment deadlines and stuff like that. It basically just meant I genuinely cared about them, and I showed that to them without them having to earn it. And I also genuinely cared about the work we were doing and who we were doing it for. And modeling care in this way invited them to care too, and they did. They cared about me, and they cared about each other, and they cared about our work. So these first two studies helped me clarify how students changed in the class and how those changes created conditions and outcomes of restoration. And so then I wanted to bridge those findings to see how it would work in the library space. And that was the focus of my third study. My third research question was, how can we inspire library workers to engage the restorative potential of libraries? And I designed a research study that had 3 phases. In the first phase, I interviewed subject matter experts across the library field and also in adjacent fields like museums and cultural nonprofits. I took guidance from these experts and I used it to inform the second phase, which was a series of focus groups. And I hosted 3 focus groups with library workers. The first one was library workers in small and rural libraries. The second was in suburban and urban libraries. And the third is in academic libraries. These focus groups allowed me to vet the ideas from the subject matter experts and also to better understand the stressors and coping strategies of library workers, in particular, as it has changed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I used the insights from these 2 phases to then design a participatory design workshop. And that was a series of 6 2-hour Zoom meetings that occurred over the span of 3 weeks. And it had library workers and also creative agitators. And creative agitators were artists and designers that weren't necessarily working for libraries. And in that workshop, we co-designed a prototype called the Library Workers Field Guide to Designing and Discovering Restorative Environments. So that is the toolkit of resources down here. This toolkit started as a sort of straightforward mapping of my Info 360 curriculum to what my best guess would be relevant and meaningful for library workers based on what I'd learned from the focus groups and the interviews. It was sort of like a how-to guide that featured a step-by-step process of how to design a restorative environment in a library. But through the feedback in the workshop, the guide was completely reframed and repackaged as a set of tools and resources that someone could draw upon to imagine and explore restorative environments. And this shift was in response to the participants being universally concerned about equitable access to the guide. They noted that the workers who would need to restore the most likely didn't have the institutional power to engage in the work in the first place. So as a result, the original guide, which required a fair amount of personal and institutional commitment to engage, turned into a product that library workers could use without any institutional buy-in at all. And this shift was catalyzed sort of halfway through the workshop when a participant mentioned Christopher Alexander's book, A Pattern Language. Alexander was an architect, and his book was about understanding that sort of sense we get when we go to a place and it just works. And the reasons why it just works to Alexander were these patterns. And so we started to use a pattern metaphor to explore restorative patterns. And I just want to kind of give you an example of how Christopher Alexander thinks if you're not familiar with this work. So here's how he would describe and has described where to decide to put a window in a building that he is designing. He said that it's not about aligning the window according to some sort of grid or even to some sort of golden ratio. It's more akin to figuring out where the window goes in the same kind of manner that a leaf decides where to be on the branch of a tree. That is, that the window needs to go in the context of its environment, just like the leaf needs to be on the context of that branch, in the context of that tree, and in the context of its surrounding forest. This framing shifted our prototype, and it also changed my orientation to the whole concept of restoration. I realized that it wasn't a formula we needed, like attention restoration theory, but rather a way to meet each library worker in the context of their lived experience and their library and their community. So the tools that we have created are freely available at a website, restorativelibrary.org. It contains the guidebook and also content on what restorative environments are, and then these 24 different design activities. And there's also a calendar for monthly meetups, because the participants in the workshop felt that since the guidebook and website were created in community, it should be used in community as well. There are future plans to provide analog versions of the guide in the form of a card catalog drawer that sits on your desk, and the activity cards sort of accordion out depending on how detailed they are. And the guidebook is printed as well. That way you don't need to use digital tools at all if you want to have a completely analog experience. So that's what we made in the workshop. And in many ways, it's where all this work led, was to this toolkit. But the product, the toolkit, was not the only outcome of the study. The process was an outcome too. And this is where I was able to apply the findings from the first two studies into the third. And so I'd like to give an example of what that looked like. So like in the class, the workshop asked participants to do field work. The class had assignments that they would do in between class. And in the workshop, they had fieldwork assignments that they would do in between sessions. And one of those assignments was this assignment called the site visit. Essentially, the assignment was go someplace you tend to go to come back to yourself, spend 20 minutes there, and then reflect on the experience. And then there were some reflection, there's some scaffolding to help with that reflection. And by the way, this is an awesome thing to do, and you can go to the website and do it yourself and see some examples if you'd like. So every participant went and did this. They filled out their field work, and we gathered in the next session to have a conversation about it. The conversation we had, so there were 20 people in the conversation, and it was sort of like one person at a time on a Zoom call would talk about their experience. And this conversation that we had was very rich, and people were very thoughtful while they were talking. And it was also very slow. And so as time was going on, I was thinking, I was feeling some tension because I had a design activity planned for the second hour and we were running out of time to do it. So, keep in mind, I only had 12 hours total with these people, and I really needed to do some design work in order to figure out this guide. So what I had learned in the first two studies helped me in that moment because they helped me understand how important integrity was to the whole process. I realized I couldn't rush them to a restorative place. Like that would have lacked integrity. And so I decided to let the conversation stay at its pace. And a few moments later, a participant said, "Can I just say, I feel like this is becoming my restorative space, this like amazing slow conversation," to which several others nodded in agreement. And I realized that my participants were finding that conversation restorative because I'd created an environment where they could put down the cynicism and walls that they'd constructed to protect themselves from being harmed by their institutions. And if I have violated that safety by not seeing how precious it was for them to be able to have an amazing slow conversation with one another, those walls would have gone right back up. And this reminds me of some of the guidance that one of my subject matter experts gave me in that first phase of Q3. She said, "Imagine getting to the revolution and not being able to trust it because you don't even know what it's like to sit in joy. What if part of the building that world is knowing how to exist in it? So that when you can put the labor down, you will actually be able to put the labor down. What if we protected you? What if we nurtured and honored you so that you could face it?" My research guided me like a North Star through moments like this one when I wasn't sure how to proceed. It gave me the courage to steer us toward radical things like generosity and slowness and caring. It allowed us to momentarily inhabit the world we were trying to build. One of my workshop participants introduced me to a quote of Christopher Alexander's after the workshop ended. And the quote is this: "People are deeply nourished by the process of creating wholeness." I'm not sure how this quote would have landed on my ears without all the work that I have done in this dissertation, but it serves now as a shorthand for everything that I have learned. This is how this dissertation has changed the way that I see the world. It has helped me to understand how to hold space for people to be whole. And that includes myself. As I wrote the dissertation, as I planned this talk, and even in this very moment, I am asking myself, do I feel more whole doing this? Am I more alive? Do I feel like this is coming from my true self? And being able to say yes to those questions affects the things that I make, including spaces that I hold for students and for research participants. And I think it also has the potential to influence the way that anything is made, including the technologies that rob our attention in the first place. I'm not saying that it's the solution to the problem of the attention economy, but I do wonder if any solution could be had without it. So thank you for your time and attention. As I hope you know by now, they're very valuable to me. I'd also like to do a special thanks to my advisor, David, and to my parents and to Marilyn, because they have walked, my wife, Marilyn, because they have walked every single step of this journey with me. And I so appreciate their devotion. I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Yay!